The living room that evening was overflowing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the sweet smell of roasted chicken. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 75 years old. Nights like this, you'd think I was surrounded by love. But the truth, my family never really noticed me. I was sitting quietly in the corner, rocking little Emma on my lap. She was drifting to sleep against my chest, her small hand curled around my sweater. Everyone else was crowded around the big dining table, telling jokes, snapping pictures for social media, raising their glasses like they were the only ones who mattered. And then it happened. My grandson, barely 12, blurted out with a giggle that cut through the noise. "Grandma's just the babysitter." The room erupted in laughter. My son chuckled. My daughter-in-law smirked, swirling her wine like she'd been waiting for that moment. Even the neighbors at the table grinned, as if it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. I didn't laugh. I smiled faintly and stroked Emma's hair, but inside a quiet sting spread through my chest. Babysitter. That's all they thought I was. "Mom," my daughter-in-law added, her tone sharp like a queen issuing orders. "You should be grateful we let you stay here. Just focus on the kids and leave the finances to us." Her words cut sharper than a knife. My son nodded along, never even looking my way. To them, I wasn't a mother anymore. I wasn't a woman who had worked, sacrificed, and built a life. No, I was just an old lady taking up space in their house, only useful when they needed free hands. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because they had no idea who I really was, or what I was still capable of. They thought I was just the babysitter, but soon they would discover a truth I had kept hidden for decades. The days that followed felt heavier than the laughter that night. My role in the house was clear. Not a mother, not a woman of worth, but simply the unpaid babysitter. Every morning I was the first one up, fixing Emma's breakfast, packing the kids' lunches, folding laundry while the rest of the house still slept. By the time my son and his wife walked into the kitchen, everything was already in place, yet they never once said thank you. Instead, they would talk over me, as though I wasn't even there. At dinner, I'd set the table, only to watch from the far end while my son and daughter-in-law held the spotlight, debating stocks, vacations, and mortgages. They never asked my opinion. They never even looked in my direction. I was invisible. One afternoon, as I pushed Emma's stroller down the driveway, a neighbor waved and said with a chuckle, "Lucky you live with them, Helen. Saves you from the nursing home, huh?" I smiled politely, but inside the words cut deep. Even outsiders saw me the same way, as a burden tucked quietly into a corner. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself alone in the kitchen again. The refrigerator hummed softly. The clock ticked like it was counting down my patience. I looked down at my hands, wrinkled, veined, yet still strong. These hands had carried children, built a home, paid debts when there was no one else to turn to, and now they acted as if these hands were only good for holding babies. I pressed my palms flat against the table and whispered to the silence. "They've forgotten who I am, but I haven't." What they didn't know was that for decades, I had been building something in secret, something they could never take from me. My mind drifted back to the late 1980s, a time when the world seemed determined to break me. I was 38, newly widowed after my husband's sudden heart attack. One moment, I was a wife with a partner by my side. The next, I was a single mother with 2 young children and a mountain of bills that threatened to drown us all. There was no inheritance, no safety net. Just me, a blackboard full of chalk dust from teaching, and endless stacks of homework papers that I graded by lamplight until midnight. But teaching alone wasn't enough. The pay barely covered food and rent, and every time I tucked my children into bed, I would whisper a promise. "I'll find a way, somehow." That promise led me to something people thought was foolish: land. I still remember the first acre, scraggly dirt on the edge of town, nothing but weeds and a broken fence. People laughed. Why waste money on dirt, Helen? You can't feed kids with soil. But I saw what they didn't. The town council had approved new roads. There were whispers of a renewable energy company scouting locations. I wasn't just buying dirt. I was buying the future. So I kept going. 1 acre here, another acre there, quietly, patiently. Every extra penny, every teacher's bonus, every tax refund went straight into land. I drove the same rusty car for 20 years. I wore the same winter coat until the lining gave out. To my children, it looked like we had nothing. But behind closed doors in a locked drawer, the deeds began to pile up. There were nights when I almost gave up, when the bills stacked higher than my hope. Once, my son needed emergency surgery. I sat at the table with the deed in my hands, ready to sell it just to pay the hospital. But something in me whispered, "Hold on. One day this will matter." So I held on. And as the years rolled by, I watched those empty fields sprout towers, solar panels, and factories. With every expansion, the value of my land grew. I didn't tell anyone, not even my children. To them, I was just their frugal mother, clinging to scraps. But in truth, I was building a silent empire. Decades later, those quiet choices would become the very thing that shook my family to its core. A week later, they called for a family meeting. But I knew what it really was, a performance. The dining room, once filled with laughter, now felt like a boardroom. My son sat at the head of the table, papers stacked neatly before him. His wife hovered behind, arms crossed like a queen guarding her throne. My grandchildren watched silently, sensing the tension but not understanding it. "Mom," my son began, his tone clipped and businesslike. "We've decided it's best to sell this house. You don't need all this space at your age. The money can go toward the kids' college." He slid the contract across the table. "Just sign here," he said flatly, "and we'll take care of everything." The chandelier above buzzed faintly, but the silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on me, the fragile grandmother, the so-called babysitter. I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I reached slowly into my worn leather purse. My fingers brushed against the envelope I had carried for decades, waiting for this very moment. I laid it on the table. The room seemed to tilt. "Before I sign anything," I said calmly, "you should take a look at these." My son frowned, annoyed, but tore the seal open. His eyes scanned the first page, and the color drained from his face. He flipped to the second, then the third, his hands trembling. What is this?" he stammered. My daughter-in-law snatched the documents. Her confident smirk vanished as her eyes widened. The grandchildren leaned forward, sensing a shift. Inside that envelope were deeds, investment certificates, bank statements, proof that those forgotten acres of dirt had been sold to a renewable energy giant worth over $5 million. The air cracked with disbelief. I leaned back in my chair, my voice sharp as glass but steady as stone. "You thought I was just a babysitter, but I built the very foundation you're standing on. And make no mistake, respect is not optional. It's the only currency I've ever valued." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. For the first time in years, my family looked at me with something new. Not pity, not mockery, but fear and awe. What happened next would decide whether they still saw me as a servant or finally recognized me as the woman who held the power. My son's face turned crimson as he clutched the papers. His voice cracked, louder than he meant it to be. $5 million. Why didn't you tell us?" His wife leaned forward, her tones suddenly coated with honey. "Oh, Mom, we could have helped you manage it. You shouldn't carry this burden alone." I laughed, not loud, not cruel, but the kind of laugh that comes after years of silence. "Help me," I said, my voice steady. "No, what you wanted was control, to treat me like an old woman too useless to think for herself." The sweetness melted from her face. My son slammed his palm on the table. "That's not true. We were trying to protect you." I turned to him, my gaze sharp, the same look I used when he was a boy sneaking out past curfew. "Protect me," I repeated slowly, "by selling my home out from under me, by calling me a burden, by letting your child laugh and say I was just the babysitter while you joined in." The words hit like a whip. He lowered his eyes but had no answer. My daughter-in-law tried again, her voice trembling now. "We didn't mean it that way. We love you. We just didn't know you had all this." "That's right," I cut her off, my tone steel. "You didn't know because you never cared enough to look. You saw wrinkles, not wisdom. You saw age, not strength. You saw me as a servant, not a woman who built something from nothing." I pulled the documents back toward me, sliding them neatly into the envelope. "Let me make this clear. I will decide what happens with this money. And if either of you ever speaks to me with that same disrespect again, you won't see a dime of it." The air in the room turned electric. My grandchildren, once giggling at the dinner table, now sat frozen, eyes wide with awe. For the first time in years, the room belonged to me, not them. I stood, my back straighter than it had been in decades. My voice calm but final. "Money can buy houses. It can buy cars, but it cannot buy character. And what you've shown me is that you're bankrupt." Silence. No one dared to speak. And in that silence, I knew my power was no longer hidden. It was mine to wield. That night, I didn't wait for their excuses. I didn't need them. The power shift was complete. I slipped the envelope back into my purse, smoothing the front of my simple cardigan as though I had just closed a chapter no one else had been able to read. My son's lips parted, desperate for words. "Mom, please." I raised a hand, calm, final. "No, respect isn't something you beg for after the money's on the table. It's something you show every day in the way you speak, in the way you treat people. You had your chance." His wife's eyes brimmed with tears, but I could still see greed flickering behind them. I didn't look at her again. Instead, I turned to my grandchildren, the same ones who had laughed at me days before. Their wide eyes followed me now, not with mockery, but with awe. I bent down beside little Emma, brushing her soft hair away from her face. "Remember this, sweetheart," I whispered. "Never measure someone by what you see on the surface. People carry whole worlds inside them." The room stayed frozen as I walked toward the door. Each step echoed like a verdict. Outside, the evening sun dipped low, painting the sky with strokes of gold and crimson. I settled onto the porch swing, the cool wood beneath me steady, familiar. The apple trees my husband had planted decades ago glowed in the fading light. In my lap lay the envelope, heavy not only with wealth, but with every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every quiet victory I had carried alone. I lifted my teacup and let out a long, steady breath. For years, they had called me just a babysitter. But now they knew the truth. I was the architect of a legacy they could never erase. And with that legacy, I wouldn't just protect myself. I would protect the dignity of every woman who was ever underestimated. And if they think my story ends here, they are wrong. Because this was never just about